It is true that Beijing Plus 25 comes at a time of unprecedented global challenges, including increasingly protracted conflict and humanitarian crises, the escalation of extreme weather events and environmental degradation, and notwithstanding that, the rise of illiberal democracies, which are exacerbating the already shrinking space for civil society organizations. We know from our own experience as feminists that women's organizations are often at the forefront of and leading progressive change. And this is increasingly backed up by research and evidence as well. Presence of autonomous women's organizations has been found to be one of the most important factors in progressive legal and policy reform, for example, on violence against women. And so we believe that women's civil society plays an absolutely critical role in addressing the challenges of our time in at least three ways that I will speak about in these few minutes. Number one, in demanding accountability. Number two, in creating networks for change. And number three, in bringing to bear testimony and evidence that can compel action. A few examples on my first point of accountability. When we think of climate justice, it's hard not to think about the phenomenon of Greta Thunberg, who is one of the key roles of civil society that this young woman is truly leading the charge on climate justice. But Greta is only one of the most visible of these activists. There are many other young women who are doing similarly remarkable things. We think about Artemisia Zacriaba, for example, who's a 21-year-old indigenous Brazilian woman who has been speaking out about the destruction of the Amazon and the persecution and threats that her people are facing as a result. I also think about a young woman from my own country, Autumn Peltier, who's a 15-year-old Anishinaabe girl from the First Nations in Canada, who has been advocating relentlessly for the right to water. All of these young women are bringing powerful testimony based on their own experience to national and global decision-making spaces to demand change in increasingly compelling ways. In my second point on creating networks for change, an example that springs to mind is the growing global network of feminists that have brought gender analysis to bear on macroeconomics. Until recently, this is an area of policy which was regarded as technical, without much social context or connection, almost apolitical. What feminists have done for many years is to demonstrate that when it comes to financing gender equality, by which I mean the public services that women and their families so depend on, we need an alternative approach to macroeconomics, especially to fiscal policy. And so we believe, for example, that tax is a feminist issue. Networks have been critical for women's rights work like this. And in this case, they bring together feminist economists and academia who can do technical gender budget analysis with campaigners and advocates in civil society who can bring this analysis to bear in policy debates. For example, the Women's Budget Group in the UK is one of the oldest of these networks. And more recently, FemNet, the Pan-African Network for Women's Rights, has been very active in training activists on macroeconomics to increase our collective knowledge and confidence in these issues so that we can demand a place at the table where these issues are discussed. And finally, my third point on evidence and testimony. This is absolutely critical, especially within the context of shrinking civil society space. I think we need analysis backed up by data and especially backed up by women's testimonies to make the connections between the backlash we are seeing on gender equality and the broader trends of rising nationalism and xenophobia in order to really understand what's happening. To answer the question of why feminist and women's civil society matters in addressing these problems, the answer simply is that they are on the front lines of these issues, in spite of the escalating threats that they often face. And these threats are significant. For example, in the first half of 2019 alone, Colombia recorded 447 threats, 20 homicides, and 13 homicide attempts against women leaders, human rights defenders, and peace builders. These women are being threatened and killed because they have demanded a voice on their country's future. So the question here is more about what governments and organizations, including the UN, needs to do to support and protect these courageous activists. The answers are not new, but they are increasingly urgent, and including ensuring funding is available for women's organizations to do their work and to put in place additional security measures to create safe spaces for activists to organize, network, and mobilize.